I never thought a handwritten check would change my life, but here we are. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I found the envelope in my mailbox, tucked between bills and junk mail. The fundraiser had been my desperate attempt to save the community center where I taught art classes to kids every weekend. The city was planning to demolish it to make room for luxury condos, and I'd started an online campaign hoping to raise enough money to at least delay the inevitable while we fought for alternatives. Most donations came through the website, small amounts from friends and strangers who believed in what we were doing. But this envelope was different. I almost didn't open it right away. The handwriting on the front was careful, deliberate, the kind of penmanship that feels rare these days. My name and address were written in dark blue ink, each letter formed with intention. When I finally tore it open, a check fell out. $5,000. I actually gasped out loud, standing there in my apartment hallway like an idiot, staring at this piece of paper that represented more than half of what we still needed to raise. There was no note, no explanation, just the check, made out to the Community Center Fund. Anonymous donor, it said in the memo line. But it wasn't the amount that made my hands shake. It was the handwriting. I knew that handwriting. I'd seen it before, though I couldn't immediately place where. The way the loops curved just slightly to the left, the distinctive way the capital letters were formed with that extra flourish at the top. It was familiar in a way that made my chest tighten, like remembering a dream you can't quite grasp. I took the check inside and sat at my kitchen table, just staring at it. My roommate Priya came home and found me like that, and when I showed her, she screamed loud enough that our neighbor knocked on the wall. But even as we celebrated, even as I posted about the anonymous donation on the fundraiser page and watched the momentum build as other people were inspired to give, I couldn't stop thinking about that handwriting. It took me 3 days to figure it out. I was at the community center, organizing supplies in the storage room, when I found an old sign-up sheet from 2 years ago. Parent volunteers for the summer art intensive. And there, halfway down the page, I saw it. The same handwriting. Casper Monroe. My heart literally stopped for a second. Casper had volunteered that summer, helping me manage a dozen energetic kids during a week-long painting workshop. We'd worked side by side for 5 days, and I'd developed what I can only describe as the most intense crush I'd ever experienced as a grown man. Casper was quiet in a way that made you want to know what he was thinking. He had this way of listening that made you feel like you were the only person in the room, these green eyes that seemed to catch light differently than anyone else's. He was patient with the kids, creative in his problem-solving, and had this subtle sense of humor that would catch me off guard and make me laugh at the most unexpected moments. I'd spent that whole week acutely aware of his presence, the sound of his voice, the way he'd push his dark hair back when he was concentrating. I'd catch myself watching him show a kid how to blend colors or clean a brush, and I'd feel this ache in my chest that I hadn't felt since high school. But I'd never said anything, never even hinted at what I felt. Because Casper had seemed so self-contained, so complete in himself, and I'd convinced myself that my feelings were one-sided. That summer ended, and he'd moved across town for a new job. We'd exchanged numbers, said we should grab coffee sometime, but life got busy and it never happened. I'd thought about him more often than I wanted to admit, wondered what he was doing, whether he ever thought about those 5 days we'd spent covered in paint and surrounded by kids' laughter. And now, 2 years later, he'd donated $5,000 to save the place where we'd met. Anonymously. Or at least, he'd tried to be anonymous. I didn't know what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to call him immediately, to thank him, to ask why he'd done it. But another part of me, the part that had been too scared to say anything 2 years ago, hesitated. What if I was reading too much into it? What if it was just a generous donation from someone who cared about the community center, nothing more? The fact that he'd kept it anonymous suggested he didn't want recognition or thanks. but I couldn't let it go. For the next week, I carried that check with me everywhere before depositing it, pulling it out at random moments just to look at the handwriting. I found myself remembering details from that summer I thought I'd forgotten. The way Casper would hum quietly while he worked, always the same melody I never could identify. How he'd brought homemade cookies one day because one of the kids had mentioned loving chocolate chip. The afternoon it rained and we'd all gotten soaked running the art supplies inside, and Casper had laughed, really laughed, and I'd thought it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. Priya finally confronted me about it. We were making dinner, and I was clearly distracted, stirring pasta and staring at nothing. She said, "You need to call him." I told her I couldn't, that it would be weird, that he obviously wanted to remain anonymous. She pointed her wooden spoon at me and said, "He donated $5,000 to something you care about. That's not nothing. That's not casual. That's someone who cares about what matters to you." I thought about that all night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. I realized that I'd spent 2 years wondering what if. What if I'd been braver that summer? What if I'd asked him to get coffee, really pushed for it instead of letting the invitation fade into nothing? What if I'd told him that working beside him had been the highlight of my week? That I'd looked forward to seeing him every morning with an intensity that surprised me? I'd always been cautious with my heart. Growing up in a small town where being gay meant being different in a way that wasn't always safe, I'd learned to keep my feelings close, to not assume, to protect myself first, even after moving to the city, even after coming out and building a life where I could be openly myself. Some of that caution remained. I'd had relationships, sure, but nothing that really shook me. Nothing that felt like it mattered enough to risk real vulnerability. But Casper had shaken me. Just 5 days, and he'd gotten under my skin in a way I couldn't explain. And now, this donation, this gesture that was both incredibly generous and somehow deeply personal, it felt like the universe was giving me another chance. A chance to be braver this time. I found his number in my phone, still saved from 2 years ago. My thumb hovered over the call button for a solid 5 minutes before I chickened out and texted instead. "Hey, this is Marcus from the community center. I know it's been a while, but I wanted to reach out. Do you have time for that coffee we talked about?" I sent it before I could overthink it, then immediately wanted to throw my phone across the room. It was 10 at night. Too late for a casual text. He'd think I was weird. He probably wouldn't even remember me. 2 years was a long time. Maybe he was in a relationship now. Maybe he'd moved away. Maybe... My phone buzzed. Marcus. Of course I remember. I'd love to grab coffee. This weekend? I stared at that text for so long the screen went dark. He remembered. He said yes immediately. No hesitation, no excuses. My heart was doing something complicated in my chest, something between hope and terror. I texted back suggesting Sunday afternoon at a cafe near the community center, and he agreed. I didn't sleep well that night, or the next, or any night that week. I kept rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd bring up the donation, whether I should bring it up at all. Priya told me I was overthinking it, which was absolutely true, but not helpful. By Sunday morning, I'd changed my outfit 4 times and was seriously considering faking my own death to get out of it. But I went. I got to the cafe 15 minutes early and ordered a coffee I was too nervous to drink. And then Casper walked in, and it was like no time had passed at all. He looked exactly as I remembered, maybe a little more tired around the eyes, his hair slightly longer. He smiled when he saw me. This warm, genuine smile that made my stomach flip, and suddenly all my rehearsed conversations disappeared from my brain. We hugged briefly, and I was aware of everything. The scent of his cologne, the solidity of his shoulder under my hand, the way my body seemed to recognize his proximity like coming home. We sat down, and for a few minutes we just did the normal catching up thing. He told me about his job as a graphic designer, how he'd been working on a big campaign for a non-profit. I told him about the community center, the kids I was teaching, the fundraiser. And then he said, "I saw your campaign online. It's really impressive what you're doing. The way you talked about the center, what it means to the neighborhood. I could hear how much you care. It reminded me of that summer we worked together. You were so good with those kids. So patient and creative." I've thought about that week a lot, actually. My coffee cup paused halfway to my mouth. He'd thought about it. About that week. About me, maybe. I set the cup down carefully and said, "I've thought about it too. A lot more than I probably should admit." He met my eyes then, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read, something uncertain and hopeful at the same time. He said, "I almost called you so many times." After that summer ended, I kept finding excuses why I shouldn't. Thought maybe I was imagining things, reading too much into moments that were probably just normal friendships. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Reading too much into moments. He'd been feeling what I'd been feeling. All this time, we'd both been wondering, both been too scared to reach out. I took a breath and decided to be brave. "I recognized your handwriting," I said. "On the check." His eyes widened slightly, and I watched a flush creep up his neck. He looked down at his coffee, and I could see him processing this, deciding something. When he looked back up, he said, "I wanted to help. I knew how much the center meant to you, but I also didn't know if reaching out directly would be welcome. It had been so long, and I thought maybe you'd moved on, forgotten about some guy you worked with for a week 2 years ago. I could have laughed or cried. Instead, I reached across the table and touched his hand. Just briefly. I said, "Casper, I haven't stopped thinking about you since that summer." I was too scared to do anything about it then, too worried about reading the situation wrong. But I'm tired of being scared. That donation, that incredibly generous, thoughtful donation, it wasn't just about the center, was it? He turned his hand over, catching my fingers in his. His palm was warm, and I could feel his pulse at his wrist, quick like mine. He said, "No, it wasn't just about the center. It was about you, about supporting something you cared about, because I care about you. I've cared about you since that first day when you showed up covered in paint before the kids even arrived. And you laughed about it instead of being stressed. You made everything feel lighter that week. Made me feel lighter. And when I saw the fundraiser, I thought, this is my chance to show up for him, even if he never knows it's me. But I did know. I knew because I'd memorized the way he formed his letters, because I'd kept that sign-up sheet all this time without even realizing why. I knew because some part of me had been looking for him in every room I entered for 2 years. I said, "I'm really glad you donated. And I'm even more glad you agreed to coffee." He smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "We should have done this 2 years ago," he said. "Better late than never," I replied, and I meant it with everything in me. We stayed at that cafe for 3 hours. Talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his family, his complicated relationship with his father, who still struggled with having a gay son. I told him about my own journey, the friends who'd become my chosen family when my biological one hadn't understood. We talked about art and design, about the projects we dreamed of doing, about the ways we'd both changed and grown in 2 years. And underneath all of it was this current of awareness, of possibility. Every time our hands brushed reaching for our coffee cups, every time our knees touched under the table, I felt it. This pull between us that had always been there, finally acknowledged, finally given room to exist. When we finally left the cafe, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. We walked toward the community center without discussing it, and I showed him the progress we'd made. The building was still standing, and with the fundraiser money, we'd hired a lawyer to help us negotiate with the city. There was hope now, real hope, that we could save it. Standing in the empty art room where we'd first worked together, Casper said, "I was terrified to see you today. Thought maybe I'd built you up in my head, that the reality wouldn't match the memory, but you're exactly who I remembered. Only better, because now I know you felt it too. That whole week, I thought I was losing my mind, feeling so drawn to someone I barely knew." I turned to face him fully. We were standing close, closer than friends stand, and I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. I said, "You weren't losing your mind. I felt it too. Every moment of every day that week, and every day since, if I'm being honest." He reached up, hesitant, and touched my face. His fingers were gentle against my jaw, and I leaned into the touch without thinking. He said, "Can I kiss you? I've wanted to for 2 years." I didn't answer with words. I closed the distance between us and kissed him. Finally, after all this time of wondering and wanting. It was soft at first, tentative, learning each other, then deeper, more certain, as 2 years of longing found their outlet. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I threaded my fingers through his hair, and it felt like everything I'd imagined and nothing like it at the same time, because reality was so much better than fantasy. When we pulled apart, we were both breathing hard, and Casper was smiling in a way that made him look younger, lighter. He said, "So, I know this is probably moving fast, but I really don't want to wait another 2 years to see you again." I laughed and kissed him again, quick and sweet. "How about tomorrow?" I suggested. "And the day after that, and the day after that." He said yes to all of it. Yes to tomorrow. Yes to taking things one day at a time. Yes to exploring whatever this was between us without fear or hesitation. We left the community center hand in hand, and I felt like I was walking on air. Sometimes the universe gives you a second chance, and sometimes you're brave enough to take it. That was 6 months ago. The community center is still standing. We won our fight with the city, and the building is now protected as a historic landmark. I still teach art classes every weekend, and Casper volunteers when he can, and the kids adore him. We've built something real together, something that started with 5 days covered in paint and a donation with familiar handwriting. Last week, Casper moved into my apartment. Priya moved in with her girlfriend, and it felt like the natural next step for us. I wake up next to him now, watch him make coffee in the morning, listen to him hum that same melody he always hummed. I've learned it's from a song his grandmother used to sing to him. I've learned 1,000 small things about him, and I want to learn 1,000 more. Sometimes I think about that check, about how close I came to not recognizing the handwriting, to letting the moment pass. I think about all the ways this could have never happened, all the chances we could have missed, but we didn't miss them. We found our way back to each other, and that matters more than the time we lost. Love isn't always a lightning bolt. Sometimes it's a slow recognition, a familiar handwriting on an envelope, a second chance you're finally brave enough to take. Sometimes it's $5,000 donated anonymously because someone cares about what you care about. Sometimes it's 2 years of wondering transformed into a lifetime of certainty. I'm grateful for all of it. The waiting, the wondering, the fear, the courage. Because it brought me here, to this life, to this man who saw me and chose me and keeps choosing me every day, and I choose him right back, over and over, with everything I have.